Episode 1 of Dept Q begins with a crime scene being examined by officers. However, things soon take a turn for the worst when a masked man arrives and shoots all of them. DCI Kyle Mork is among them, and as a killer looks over him, Kyle loses consciousness. However, he's still alive and survives this near fatal incident. His fellow officer Hardy is also still alive, but he's paralysed and in hospital for the foreseeable future after being shot in the spine. Kyle is not happy about the mandatory therapy he has to attend and flippantly brushes over the after effects of this with his therapist Rachel. Kyle is not sleeping though, he has anxiety, and he also seems to have a superiority complex too, at least according to Rachel. Elsewhere, we meet a prosecutor by the name of Merritt Lingard. She's right in the midst of handling a case involving an abusive husband called Graham Finch. He's on trial for killing his wife. The evidence is quite substantial against him, and Merritt is overly emotional and hot-headed. Unfortunately, Merritt walks right into the trap of allowing Finch to empathise with the jury, convincing them that he's innocent. Along with failing the case, Merritt continues to be haunted by the ghosts of her past, stemming from emails and texts she's receiving from someone that's threatening her. Merritt also has a brother called William, who's disabled and is looked after by a carer called Claire while she's not there. Spooked by one of her more recent messages, Merritt decides to pack her stuff up and head off with William on a trip together. Unfortunately, she receives another text while on the boat with her brother, telling her she can't hide. Back at the station, Kyle turns heads when he rocks up ready to return to work. He trades banter with a fiery redhead called Rose before ripping into the officers on his case, given they have no evidence and no witnesses, despite having one that's changed their statement at the last second. Kyle looks over at all the evidence they've got so far and scrutinises their ineptitude. He immediately points out the McDonald's cup under one of the car's wheels, demanding they check the CCTV footage from the nearby McDonald's to see if they catch a break with the killer. Now, while this is going on, the cabinet secretary is proposing setting up a new department to look into more cases. Superintendent Moira Jacobson is the one running things here, and she's quick to shoot the proposal down. She explains that they're stretched thin as it is, with barely enough manpower to cover the cases they do have. However, when she finds out that a department will have its own budget and full control over which cases to be chosen, it certainly piques her interest. And the man she's thinking of bringing into this to spearhead the project? Yep, it's Kyle. He's going to be investigating cold cases from all over the country, but he's not particularly happy about it when he finds out. To make matters worse, the office is also in the basement and the place is a complete mess. It's clear now that Moira is using the allocated funds for this new department to beef up the main office, all whilst finding a place to relegate Kyle away from the others. He's not stupid and understands what's happening here, but he also explains that he needs a secretary to help sift through all the files. He wants Rose to help, but instead she brings Akram down, a man who works part-time in IT but wants to move into their department. Funnily enough, Akram actually has a fair amount in common with Kyle. He's confident, intelligent, and he's read through many of these cold cases. He used to be a police officer in Syria, so he's well equipped to handle tough cases and could be just what Kyle needs to make a dent here. Kyle brings him on board, where Akram sifts through and finds a case they can work on. This case happens to be Merritt Lingard's disappearance. It's here we learn that her scene sprinkled throughout this episode actually occurred 4 years back, when she went missing. The last place she was found was on that boat we saw earlier on, and we cleverly learn now that these are two different timelines. In reality, Merritt is still alive, but she's being kept captive in a steel pressurized tank, which happens to be a hyperbaric chamber somewhere secluded in a warehouse, which is where episode 1 of Dept Q comes to an end. Episode 2 of Dept Q begins with a look at Merritt's hellacious ordeal while trapped inside this metal prison. She uses chalk to write different names up on the wall and settles on a woman called Kirsty Atkins. As we find out later in the episode, Merritt put Kirsty behind bars. She was initially a drug addict, but she's been clean for months. She also appears to have known the deceased in the Finch case, and Merritt wants to use her to testify and get a conviction. Merritt also offers a flippant proposal of getting her out, but of course this is all a play, as Merritt doesn't believe Kirsty is telling the truth. Back in the present, Akram and Kyle discuss the Merritt case and try to figure out what could have happened. Moira shows up and checks on the pair, wanting progress on their chosen case. Kyle is determined to be as abrasive and difficult as possible, but Akram immediately perks up with the Merritt case. Kyle's first port of call here is an old officer called Fergus Dunbar. He was a man in charge of investigating the Merritt Lingard case back in the day, and he's adamant he hasn't messed up the investigation. William was arrested at the time, but Fergus points out that his condition condition made it unclear how much help he'd actually be. Fergus also offered divers to look through miles of water but found nothing. Cole realises that William could be the key here and heads out with Akram to Egley House, where he's currently being kept. The woman in charge, Wallace, is quick to point out that William is not allowed to see people. Apparently some police officers came round before asking questions and left him traumatised. Carl is not just any old officer though, and believes he can get through where others have failed. Unfortunately, William has regressed in recent years and he's not communicating beyond drawing pictures. However, he's not in any condition to be opened up to this sort of trauma again, so this is very much a dead end. While Carl gets nowhere with Wallace, he does have more luck with Maggie, the receptionist. Despite claiming William gets no visitors, in reality a woman shows and brings William various trinkets every month called Claire. She's the old housekeeper we saw briefly in episode 1, and another crucial thread for our characters to follow. Claire has no love lost for Wallace though, and she's very protective over William. It's here we learn that he had an accident when he was 16 and suffered from serious head trauma, explaining his condition. Merritt never mentioned what happened at the time that caused this, but it could be important to note for later. The attention then turns to Merritt's work, and in particular the Finch case that she lost. Claire was with the family for 12 years, but only for William's sake. She never really liked Merritt, but does confirm that the bond William and Merritt had was so strong that there's no way she'd jump in the water without William following, or to abandon him to this fate. Carl's issues away from this cold case continue both with his own personal demons and his situation at home. He has an estranged relationship with his stepson Jasper, and they barely communicate at the best of times. He's also not been showing up at school, and he's busy at home with a girl whom he's having sex with and continuously plays loud music. Carl isn't sure quite how to handle this, especially as his past trauma involving the shooting threatens to rear its ugly head at any time. Carl blames himself for what happened, but he continues to be standoffish at therapy. Rachel believes he's repressing his real feelings, and the show does quite a good job of blending this scene with awkward comedy, especially as Carl puts his foot in it over the woman's looks and her marriage. It's a brief segment, but it also works quite well to give Carl a tiny bit of vulnerability. In fact, Carl's real therapy, not that he'd admit it, comes from speaking to Hardy, his partner, in hospital. He's partially paralysed as a result of that stray bullet, but Carl visits him regularly, partly out of guilt, but also to discuss the cases. He drops off Merritt's file and lets the guy have a gander. Merritt Lingard's old supervisor, Stephen Burns, shows up to see Carl here. Carl doesn't have much faith that Merritt is still alive, but Moira decides to use this to prop her own publicity up a notch. She speaks to the public about the new department and the cold cases they'll be working on. Carl is thrown right into the deep end after and has to read a statement regarding Merritt's disappearance. He fumbles his way through the whole thing, struggling to keep it together, while William immediately perks up as he watches this, as do the people keeping Merritt hostage. As for William, he throws the TV out the window and runs away from Egley House. As he does, we cut across to Carl, who leaves the press conference, spiralling and struggling to compose himself. Akram is there to see him and understands the guy is having a panic attack. Episode 3 of Dept Q begins with Merritt's kidnappers deciding to turn up the pressure to make Merritt talk. Given she's inside a pressurized tank, they crank up the air pressure to make her crack. Meanwhile, Akram and Carl are out on the case. They find out about William's disappearance and retrace the final steps of William and Merritt on board their ferry bound for the island of Moore. The hat situation is an interesting one because, as we soon find out, throwing the hat in the air with the wind like this causes the hat to land in the parking bay on board the ferry. Now, the camera angle we saw before made it seem like it fell in the water. Merritt isn't in any of the footage from the cameras down here either, only William. This, coupled with the fact that the ferry tickets were bought that very morning, seem to hint that whoever has Merritt were clearly watching her and have been for a while. Looking into Merritt's past brings up some interesting revelations too. The one who initially attacked William and caused his head injury is a guy by the name of Harry Jennings. He's a local offender and broke into the Lingard household where the attack initially occurred. He died trying to evade arrest by jumping off a ferry. While Harry is no use here, they do find a clue coming in the form of Jamie Lingard. Merritt's father is a fisherman who lives as a recluse after initially drinking too much in the past. Akram and Carl show up at the man's house but don't find him particularly cooperative. There's no love lost between Jamie and Merritt either, and despite not seeing each other for 12 years, it's unclear exactly why Merritt would choose choose to head out and see him now. Jamie also reveals that Merritt stole a necklace that belonged to Lila, her mum, which could be part of the hostility between the two. But there's clearly more going on here than we're being led to believe. Jamie visited William at Egley House the day after Merritt's death, but he never bothered to show up again after that because it was too hard. Akram is confident that they're going to solve this case though, convinced that William will be easier to find than they think. Speaking of which, William actually wanders all the way back to their old house, which is derelict and a complete mess. He heads up to his old room where he finds a number of drawings of Merritt and his father. Interestingly, there's also one of an aquatic bird called a loon, although apparently the episode makes note of it being a booberry, and as someone who isn't a bird watcher, I'm guessing this is correct? We'll have to wait and see, I guess. This also happens to be the same symbol we saw briefly on the back of one of the ferry workers, and it could be an important point to make. William dozes off on the sofa downstairs though, but he's awoken by a bunch of junkies that have taken over the house. They scare him into fleeing. Back at the station, Rose wants to be part of Dept Q. She's getting nowhere with Moira and she's sick of constantly shuffling paperwork. Now, Rose has not been on an active case for 2 years thanks to suffering a heart attack and the police unwilling to put her in the line of fire again. Rose manages to convince Carl to take her on, but only on a trial basis, and only if she can go the whole day without annoying him. Carl has a theory here in the midst of Rose's crunching and slurping, contemplating whether the case itself may have been botched from the very beginning. The team leader, Fergus Dunbar, was given Merritt's high-profile case despite not having experience in handling anything this complicated. So how did he get given this, and by whom? Carl decides to have Rose investigate this lead and see what comes up. While Rose gets to work, Carl picks at Stephen Burns. He shrugs off the insinuation that he could be involved, pointing out that he gave Merritt more opportunities than most. He also backs up the character statements we've heard before, including how she was an opportunist and hungry for more. Stephen shuts the guy down and demands he go through his office to talk further. Akram shows up at the old Lingard house and finds the junkies passed out downstairs, along with the drawings that William uncovered. Akram questions the junkies and they recognise William's picture. After a bit of pressuring, Akram finds out that he's run up the road. Naturally, Akram and Carl show back at Claire's place, having traced his movement on CCTV. It turns out he's actually out in the shed. He hands over the insignia of the bird and also a sketch of a man wearing a hat sporting the same symbol. Apparently William saw this symbol both on the ferry and at home. Flashbacks later in the episode confirm as much, with William spotting a man at the window watching him and Merritt one night. Carl heads back to see Hardy, who has read through the file and has theories of his own. He believes this is a crime of opportunity and Merritt simply bumped into the wrong person. Hardy wants to help out, but he needs a computer in order to dig a bit deeper. Carl's requests fall on deaf ears with Moira though, especially when she brings up how his therapy sessions are mandatory and not attending is a bit of a problem for them. Rachel is inside her office and alone, and she brings up his panic attack, having seen the press conference and knowing there's more going on here than he's letting anyone believe. Back in the basement, Carl sends Rose out on assignment. She's to head back to Moore and chat up the local officer Cunningham and find out about the case. He gives no illusion over why he's choosing her, given she's a woman and can sweet talk her way into getting the job done. Before she leaves, Rose looks over the evidence and checks out the aquatic bird again, which she traces back to being a booberry. As fate would have it, Booberry is also the name of the boat outside the Lingard home in Moore during the robbery, so it would appear that everything is connected, which is where episode 3 comes to an end. Episode 4 of Dept Q begins with more shots of the past. Merritt retrieves William's hat from the ferry, but she's immediately grabbed and bundled in the back of a car from a seemingly familiar voice nearby. When she awakens, she finds herself inside this pressurized tank. Back in the present, Carl heads over to therapy with Rachel. When the conversation turns to Jasper, she realizes that Carl's issues are being compounded by the responsibility leveled on his shoulders. Before they can dive deeper into this though, their time is up and the hilarious banter between them continues out the door. Carl heads back to the station next, where he overhears Logan looking into the shooting case and decides to get involved. Now, the initial theory about the shooter coming in through the back or arriving before them to wait don't hold much weight. Carl explains here that there were bins piled up at the back door, so it would have been pretty impossible to come in without making a ton of noise. The CCTV footage also shows someone in McDonald's 25 minutes before the shooting starts, and the timing is very tight for this gunman to break in and wait. So what does this mean? Well, Carl believes there may have been more than one assailant, which is something they completely overlooked initially, with both waiting in the car for them to show up. Rose speaks to Hardy and she's downcast about being cast aside on this case. She doesn't see the Moore situation as a big deal, even though it kind of is, until Hardy sets her straight. He suggests she go and see the constable, but but get him on her side by making him feel important. Heidi encourages her to look into the day-to-day patterns of Merritt's life and, in particular, what ripples may have misaligned after her disappearance. Rose shows up at Moore next, and after buttering up Cunningham, she turns her attention to Jennings. It's here we learn that Merritt came back for Jennings' funeral, hinting at a close tie between them. It would also appear she may have been in on the robbery too, given Jennings' family were desperate and their business close to going bust. A robbery would be just what they need to get back on track. Heading over to Jennings' house, Colin, the constable's son, joins Rose on the trip. There's clearly no love lost here between him and Cunningham though, and Colin reveals that there was a tech photo of the room William was found in. Someone, i.e. Cunningham, circled something on the floor with a black marker, which happens to be that aforementioned necklace. Clive Jennings' business works with hazardous material, but we don't find out exactly what. There are numerous dead birds in the area and it could be a crucial clue, but for now Rose leaves empty-handed. Back home, Carl is visited by his estranged ex, Victoria. She sits with Martin and drinks wine in the kitchen, eventually going on to mention how Jasper idolized him despite the fact that he's run away and is staying with his grandparents at the moment. Carl scoffs at the notion that Jasper actually cares until he finds out that when he was in hospital, Jasper stayed with him the entire time. She's quick to grill into him about what sort of example he's setting as a dad, and it gives him food for thought. Martin believes Victoria's onto something though and wants to talk about Leith Park that night. Carl is not in the mood but decides to open up all the same, explaining how guilty he feels about the bullet and how it hit Hardy's spine and slowed down enough to save his life as it pierced his neck. This soon shuts Martin up. Back at the basement, Akram and Rose discuss the new revelations regarding these crime scene photos. The circled necklace is the same chain that Merritt took from Jamie, which initially belonged to Lila. It was listed on the insurance claim, but she came back for it on the day of Jennings' funeral. When Carl finds out what Rose has, found out, she pokes holes in her theory regarding the bird and how it's connected to the boat. Rose admits she's unsure how everything connects together, and as far as they can tell, Merritt was a loner, she didn't have any friends, and there's nothing here to suggest life was changed much after her disappearance. The only exception stems from a letter Merritt received from someone called S, who could be an old flame. Within her office, a woman called Sabrine worked there, so Carl brings her in for questioning. She's quite open, scoffing at the potential relationship they could have had, given she doesn't bat for that team. Sabrine admires the woman though, admitting that Merritt didn't care what people thought of her and she thrived on the hostility of her workplace. The only potential individual that could be of interest at work is Stephen Burns, and Carl is very quick to go and question him at the pub. It doesn't go well, and it's a pretty prickly conversation, all things considered. Whether Stephen actually is the mysterious S or not is unclear, but we do find out at the end of the episode. Sabrine had earlier pointed to Merritt's colleague Liam Taylor, and he also happens to be someone Carl knows too. He heads out and speaks to him next, where he finds out Liam was having an affair with her, but he kept it quiet from his wife. It lasted a month, but Merritt was the one who initially ended it. It seems it was all physical for her and there weren't any feelings, with her flippant line of "thanks, see you around" confirming as much. They met at the hotel called Prince's Garden and she always paid, with the whole affair occurring a year before she disappeared. Back then, Merritt used a different name, Lila Graham. She was using an alias and even had a card under that name too. This deepens the investigation and Carl immediately shows at the hotel looking for answers. He puts heat on the poor receptionist and the guy eventually cracks, revealing that she stayed in the same room 6 times in the 2 months before she disappeared. Now, although Lila Graham's name is on the computer, it doesn't necessarily mean that Merritt was there. Liam Taylor is the authorised signature on file, but it's not Liam who was there last. It was another man by the name of Sam Hague. So what happened to Sam? Well, Merritt was using him for sex, and apparently his death is connected to Merritt. And that is where episode 4 of Department Q comes to an end. Episode 5 of Department Q starts with Carl and Akram asking Paul questions about Sam Hague. It turns out he's been dead for 4 years and he was a pretty avid climber back then. It would appear that he went climbing on his own one day without the right equipment and fell to his doom. Sam was a risk taker and very much a loner too. When he wasn't at work, he'd be rock climbing. He climbed the crag regularly, usually once a week, but when it was a bit less busy. For Sam, it would take 45 minutes or maybe a bit longer when free soloing without a rope to reach reach the top. This story though has a lot of holes in it, which Akram is quick to point out. Sam's equipment was still locked inside his car, and no keys were found at a crime scene or on his person either. However, with all of these facts being clearly ignored, it points to someone else entirely being involved. What are we not being told here? In the past, we see more flashbacks with Merritt. She's not happy with Sam sniffing around her workplace, and his editor at the Scottish Telegraph has decided that Sam should write up a story about her background regarding more. He pries into her history and lack of opening up about her family, hinting at something deeper underneath the surface. Merritt bites back though, bringing up how Sam is anonymous online and has a similar sense of wanting to protect his own persona. He keeps himself reserved from his workplace, and even they can't figure out his unpredictable nature. Back in the present, Rachel shows up in the basement looking for Carl. When she doesn't find him, she does run into Rose instead, who asks about Dr. Sonnenberg. This is a person she was initially seeing after her heart attack, and it's immediately clear that Rose has OCD and PTSD following an incident in the past where she was a passenger in pursuit when they hit an elderly pedestrian. This is the root cause of her trauma and why she's so twitchy, not to mention reluctant about getting behind the wheel of a car. Interestingly, Rachel knows who Merritt is too. She met her once at a party with an ex who was also a lawyer too, but we don't get much beyond that. When she leaves, Rose FaceTimes with Hardy and shows off the board they've been working on for this case. He recognises the bird insignia, given his ties as a fisherman, and we learn that this bird is not a blueberry, but actually a cormorant. He wants scans of this though in order to look deeper into this connection. When Carl shows up, Hardy has a theory. He believes that given Jamie was poor and Lila was not, there's some motive here around money. Lila's account is actually linked to a trust account in the Channel Islands, the bank on Jersey. The trail has gone cold here, but Carl's not particularly happy when he finds out the Hardy symptoms aren't quite so bad as he thought. He's been in rehab for a while and he may even be able to walk again at some point. Moira heads down to the basement in the midst of this and wants to be walked through what happened with Merritt. Akram is also grilled over the way he handled the junkies too, swiftly reminded that this isn't Syria and he needs to be careful. When Carl returns, he ignores Moira and speaks to his team about how they need to look further back in the timeline and, specifically, checking who the trust fund actually belongs to. Given William is not able to look after his share, it would naturally be passed to his legal guardian. And who is that? Well, it's Wallace. Carl confronts Wallace and learns that she's been siphoning money out of William's trust fund all this time. Furthermore, William himself is not doing well, lying on his stomach in his bed with drawings all over the floor of the potential killer. Wallace has been running an absolute racket here, with William, alongside other patients in her care, heavily sedated. Carl and the others take William and bring him to Claire's, someone who will actually look after him properly. Back in the basement, Rose speaks to Carl about Merritt's bank statements. She's gone through all her old receipts and credit card statements, but this time she's gone back for a year and seen something that stands out. All the shops she went to were close to the Crown offices, but one place in particular stood out given it's not nearby. This comes in the form of a laundrette near the Cowgate. She showed up there a week before she went missing, and although Carl doesn't say it, he's clearly impressed by Rose's thoroughness and suggests she go and investigate further alongside Akram. At the laundrette, Rose speaks to the owner, Shirley, who knows exactly who Merritt is and curses them out for bringing her name up. As we soon learn, this is Kirsty's mum. Remember her? Kirsty Atkins was the one put behind bars for a drug addiction, and although Merritt initially showed to apologise, she lost her nerve before she did and hurriedly left. Kirsty is still in Pentland's prison right now, which is where they put her after Merritt almost got her killed in Sawton prison. Off Akram and Rose go, heading in to see Kirsty. She's ready to start again and disappear once she's out from behind bars. Akram immediately cuts through Kirsty's tough facade and can tell that she's absolutely terrified. The attack on her life, where she lost an eye, was supposed to actually kill her. She revealed important information about Finch and was killed for it, but Merritt bailed on her at a crucial time. The plan was supposed to be that in exchange for testifying, Kirsty would get an early release. But at the last minute, she changed her mind as Kirsty wasn't credible. It seems like Kirsty pissed off someone high up, as two lifers behind bars were paid £500 in their commissary to finish the job and kill Kirsty. After speaking to Merritt on a smuggled phone prior to the attack, pleading for her life, Merritt hung up on her when she found out Kirsty was on drugs again. Kirsty was attacked several times afterwards, and not only was she stabbed in the eye, but also through her lung and another that missed her heart by a few millimeters. Hearing this, our past timeline sees Merritt decide to go and speak to Sam Hague about what she knows, which is where episode 5 of Dept Q comes to an end. Episode 6, of Department Q starts with Merritt speaking to Sam Hague about her concerns in our past timeline. She believes someone inside the Crown offices told Finch about the witness and almost had Kirsty killed. This has obviously ruffled some feathers, and Sam warns her that she could be watched right now. It's here she admits indirectly to receiving threatening emails and texts. He cuts their chat short and encourages her to pick a better spot than a cemetery she frequents next time they meet up again. The place Merritt picks is the hotel room under her pseudonym. The pair speak about Stephen Burns and his potential impact here, but only temporarily. Alone, Merritt flirts with him a little and wants to trust him. This comes from stripping right down to make sure neither is wearing a wire. But with them both naked, they naturally end up having sex. Merritt has fond memories of this incident, and, well, she isn't exactly subtle about it in a hyperbaric chamber when we cut back to the present. Elsewhere, Carl attempts to talk to Jasper, ringing and suggesting they meet and talk. After, he and Akram show at the church and talk to Fergus again, who's there drinking. He actually gave up for a while, but after the beatdown he received a day prior, he's back on the hard liquor again. Carl is clearly flying too close to the sun, and poor Icarus here has the bruises to prove it. Fergus has been warned off from pursuing this further and talking to Carl, but in a nice little twist, we learn he beat the 3 guys that surrounded him down in the parking lot after the initial sucker punch he received. Fergus being taken off the case, it seems, was Maury's call to protect him from being beaten down further, rather than to stifle the investigation. Akram has also done his homework here, and is convinced that Fergus would have solved this had he been left to continue. It's a far cry from what we initially thought regarding his ineptitude, and a nice way of subverting expectations. Along with the shooter for the Leaf Park murders apparently being caught, Carl shows up at the apartment to try and jog his own memories of the incident, which brings back painful flashes. Remember the press conference from episode 2? Well, it would appear that there's definite weight to the fact this victim found inside the apartment, Archie Allen, was a police informant. However, PC Anderson never said the victim's name. All he said was that he was there for a routine wellness check. Archie may have been bait for a bigger fish, and while Hardy and Carl were not the intended targets, the journalist could be onto something here. Anderson may have been using the bumbling officer persona to play up his own ineptitude to avoid scrutiny. In fact, they're not even sure if Archie Allen, the deceased, had a daughter. While they get on this to investigate further, we circle back to the Merritt case. Rose leads a questioning with Liam again, bringing him back in and asking specifically about his ties to Merritt and how that could pertain to Kirsty. They know that Merritt visited her during week 1 of the trial, but also that Liam's pride was hurt after the affair ended. Liam admits that he was angry and frustrated, but then he woke up and wound up embarrassed about the whole ordeal. The reason the guys are going down this route though is to try and understand if Liam swayed Merritt's opinion into not using Kirsty as a witness given her background. The one above Liam is Stephen Burns, so they seem to nail the fact that Burns was responsible for the hit against Kirsty, but we don't know why he did this just yet, if he even is involved, that is. Meanwhile, Jasper is visited by a nasty man who threatens to ruin him. He wants Jasper to pass on these threats to Carl, but when he shows at the diner, he follows the man out and immediately beats the guy to a pulp. He almost slams his head into the pavement after having blood spat at him, but Jasper stops his dad before everything gets out of control. Rose shows up to see Hardy and brings up someone called Ned Finkel. He was released from hospital 2 weeks after being run over by Julia Montgomery. He lost both his legs as a result, but according to Julia's statement, she was run off the road by another vehicle that came up alongside her. Seeing how she smacked him from behind and there's no witnesses, it's her word against his. Now, this might sound like a pointless tangent and a story that doesn't have any bearing to the show, but it's important. Why? Well, Julia's maiden name was Burns. Julia Burns is a daughter of Stephen Burns, so it seems like someone may have orchestrated this to send a message. That person could be Graham Finch, which in turn would have worked to make Stephen do his bidding. Carl shows back up at therapy, but he's taken aback when Dr. Sonnenberg is back and Rachel is nowhere to be found. He's not happy at the perceived feel of being given the runaround, and he eventually decides to leave. Akram and Rose track down Edmund here, the guy responsible for setting up Carl in the middle of the street with that charade involving Jasper. Carl isn't here, of course, given he's being chewed out by Moira back at the station, while all the other officers stand outside, hilariously listening in. Moira rips into Carl for the very public display and how he now looks like a lunatic, given this is twice in a week that he's done this. The first was with the journalist Dennis at the Scottish Telegraph, but given how scummy this journalist is, he had it coming, right? Moira refuses to fire Carl though, and just as Akram and Rose show up, Moira chews them out too, just for being in the line of fire. She calls them Team Doolally and finds out that a man who initially threatened Jasper and Carl was employed as a chauffeur for Ballantine Transfer and Security, which in itself is owned by Finch Overseas Shipping, that company's owner, Graham Finch. The gang bring up all the connections they've uncovered between Stephen Burns and Graham Finch, but right now it's not the main concern, as Carl was called in to try and point out the killer from a lineup at the Leith Park shooting. However, it doesn't look like any of the men are the ones who actually shot Carl. As the episode closes out though, we cut back to Merritt one more time where trouble is brewing. The airlock appears to be broken because moving a can of drink into a hyperbaric container causes the whole thing to explode, which is a pretty gnarly bit of foreshadowing for what could happen to Merritt. Time is of the essence, it seems. Episode 7 of Dept Q starts with Akram and Carl showing up to see Stephen Burns. They bring the connections to Kirsty, Merritt and Liam Taylor to his desk, and while Carl prods him over Kirsty's attack and Finch's potential influences with those inside the prison and outside, Akram wanders about listening intently. The mysterious deaths that occurred just after Kirsty's confession don't help Stephen's case here, and of course there's a small matter of Julia's car accident too. Akram catches Stephen out with his statements about Kirsty's addiction, given Carl never brought it up, and he cracks, at least a little anyway. The only person who can corroborate all of this is Merritt, but only if she's still alive. For the time being, Merritt is alive, but inside her hyperbaric chamber, time is very much of the essence. She scrubbed off the writing from the walls, and through flashbacks, we see that Harry Jennings and Merritt were close as kids. In fact, they used to smoke together and were in a relationship. According to Merritt, they were very much in love. Jamie is not happy with these ties, but there's not much he can do given Merritt is a wild child and doesn't really listen to anybody. Back in the present, Carl shows up to see Graham Finch next and brings up the botched hit on Kirsty. Ed Solomon, the guy they squeezed for info last episode, has quite the treasure trove of evidence on his phone, including messages directly linked to getting those inside the prison to take out Kirsty. Carl is smart and susses that the same men who visited Jasper also went after Fergus too. Now, interestingly, it was Sam Hague who told Robert, Graham Finch's lawyer, about Kirsty a day at trial. He just offered up the information willingly with nothing in return. Why? For now they don't have all the pieces, but it does appear that Finch is involved in some way. Back in the car, there's an amusing bit of dialogue between Carl and Akram as the former tries to figure out the mysterious past regarding his assistant. Akram doesn't offer anything concrete up though, as they get an unlikely call come through. It's Dennis Piper, the slimy journalist from before. Apparently he's got information to help them out and pings over a video of Sam Hague from the past. We know Sam Hague is secretive, but now we understand exactly why. He wouldn't talk to anybody at the office, when he bothered to show up to work that is, and that's because he was actually an ex-convict. Dennis hacked Hague's computer to get hold of the video, something that he himself received after being blackmailed by someone at Godhaven, the prison he was in. Sam was doing his own story and apparently covering someone who could be linked to all of this. The journo, Dennis, encourages Carl to investigate, and specifically through talking to Terry Dundee, the officer over at Godhaven, for the full story. Before Carl continues though, he speaks to Jasper about the drama and decides to finally open up and properly talk about their concerns that night. It's a really nice moment, especially as you can tell Jasper does look up to his stepdad and needs his influence, but isn't quite sure how to express it. Rose meanwhile looks into the mystery surrounding Sam Hague's death. The police initially chalked this up to a traumatic fall pretty quickly, and the timeline certainly matches, but the climbing instructor, Paul Evans, may be lying. Paul sent various messages to Sam telling him he needs to stop keeping secrets and tell the truth. It seems Paul knew about Sam's illicit affairs with Merritt, given the language in these messages. Hardy encourages Rose to go and speak to Paul again when she brings these concerns to him. Rose does just that, and Paul eventually opens up to her, admitting that he and Sam were close and they likened their climbs to therapy sessions where they'd open up and talk together. Apparently Sam never mentioned Merritt though, and the hotel he was frequenting is a completely different venue, called the Spivvy Inn. He wasn't there with Merritt though, it was Chloe. This is how Chloe is involved because, as they'd all been drinking that night, she wound up sleeping with him. Carl shows up to see Rachel at her place, but she's mystified over why she's shown up. Carl admits he's not sure either, as he came for therapy, but it seems like there may actually be feelings growing, but he's not sure how to express it. Eventually, he decides to leave and it's all very awkward. While this is happening, Merritt has an infected tooth, and after getting some pliers to cut it out, she uses those same pliers to mess up the air pressure inside the chamber, smacking the pipes and eventually Chloe blasting the wheelchair-bound lady on the other side straight over, knocking her out. Despite making it out of her prison, Merritt manages to call 999, but just as the call connects, a second assailant stomps on her forearm and proceeds to kick her in the head, which is where episode 7 of Department Q comes to an end. Episode 8 of Department Q starts with Carl showing up to see Caroline Kerr. She's a woman who rescinded her testimony regarding the shooting at Leith Park. Carl has done his homework and he lays all the cards out for her. Carl brings up how Anderson and Caroline had relations, and he also knows that the crime racket in the area is apparently run by a man named Eugene Errington. Caroline's child is actually Eugene's, and Charlie is the man working for him in the garage, giving him concerned looks as they talk. All of this ends up being a dream, especially when Carl draws a gun and shoots the guy in the head, solving the case outright. When he awakens, he decides to scribble all of this on a notepad, but is confused over exactly what its meaning is. Funnily enough, later in the episode, he gatecrashes Rachel's coffee date, having put a tracker on her phone. She asks him some quick questions about how he feels before shooing him out the door. Meanwhile, Merritt's captor brings Merritt back into a hyperbaric chamber, rattling off a monologue about how he cares for her and remembers their time together. He takes her necklace and leaves, just as we see that the old lady from before, who's wearing a wig and still very much alive, unfortunately, back in the control room. Merritt has been here for 4 years in total, if the dates on the camera footage we see is anything to go by. In that time, the pair of assailants have all the footage of her, but Merritt having her necklace ripped off seems to be what's affected her so. The suspicions regarding Merritt being in on the robbery with Harry Jennings in the past also seem to ring true, especially when she confides in Harry, during the flashback sequences that we see, that her family are rich and William is the golden boy of the family. We also get the scenes with Sam Hague recontextualized here with a bit more detail, especially as the scene from the hotel room continues from where we left off. Merritt actually offered for Sam to join her on the boat with William, but he seems to have refused. It's a small olive branch that she held out and he didn't take it. However, it's important to note here because it seems to hint that there's genuine feelings between them. Back in the present, Merritt gets her necklace back, but the puzzling question here is why? This is also something that the Department Q team are having a hard time figuring out, with the pieces of this case fragmented and not slotting together in a cohesive manner. Carl deduces that maybe Sam Hague was both hurting and helping Merritt, as evidenced by him showing up at Godhaven right before he died during the Graham Finch trial. Now, if evidence is to be believed here, Chloe and Merritt were both with Sam Hague at the same time, but perhaps someone was using Hague's name as an alias. At this point, it becomes clear that the captive who has taken Merritt is connected to Harry Jennings, and specifically, it's Harry's mum, Elsa. The person she's with happens to be Harry's brother, Lyle. Now, Lyle has been posing as Sam Hague in disguise, explaining how he's managed to remain detected all of this time. When Merritt comes to the same conclusion, she refuses to apologise for Harry's death. She stands up and points out to the pair that he deserved to die. Carl and Akram show up at Godhaven next, where they learn from Terry Dundee that Sam Hague was a sociopath and had a relationship with his teacher, along with a history of scamming numerous people. When he showed back up at Godhaven 4 years ago, under the guise of writing a book about his experiences, in reality he was more interested in one individual. The kid Sam beat up was a guy called Rocket, which is the nickname of Lyle Jennings. He's the one on the recordings, and the video could blow the whole case wide open, which is where episode 8 of Department Q comes to an end. Episode 9 of Department Q starts its finale with the interview involving Lyle Jennings. He explains on camera that he and Harry were abused as kids, with their mum using a hyperbaric chamber as punishment. This is the same chamber where Merritt is currently being kept, and according to Lyle's statement here, he was thrown in for an extended period of time, essentially pushing him into becoming a sociopath. He's convinced that Harry is always with him, and struggles to understand how Sam Hague is the kid he's following around, not his brother Harry. 10 years ago, he was released from Godhaven, and there seems there's no record of him after being transferred to the EPD unit at Rampton. This is a psychiatric hospital, and he was relocated back to Moore after, explaining how everything is connected. Logan shows up to see Moira and questions him over the Leith Park incident. He brings up how he's discovered Anderson was in on this, and this has opened a whole new line of inquiry. He also lets slip that this new information has been gained by Carl, causing Moira to grow concerned over the lack of progress he's managed to get on his own with this case. Cunningham shows up at the Jennings' house after and brings Elsa her post. He's also here to ask about a 999 call that came from her mobile. This was the same call that Merritt made outside the hyperbaric chamber at the end of the last episode. Elsa writes it off as just something she forgot, but Cunningham moves the questioning over to Lyle, worried for her well-being. Cunningham is not completely useless though, as he does some digging and realises as that 999 call shows Merritt screaming and the sound, with its echoing, hinting at her being somewhere nearby. Time is very much of the essence here though, as Lyle and Elsa turn up the heat, quite literally. The temperature inside the chamber increases, and as Merritt looks outside, she sees Cunningham. He rants for a bit to Lyle about what's happened until he beats the guy to a pulp with a hammer. As for Carl, he gathers the troops, along with William and Claire, to go over the details of this case. All of this stems from the past with Harry Jennings and the brutal beatdown of William. Flashbacks show more of what transpired here, as after the robbery, William wound up hitting Harry in the head with a stick. It wasn't Harry that gave William a brutal beatdown that night, it was actually Lyle. He's the one who continued to hit him until Harry stopped his brother. Harry kicked Lyle hard in the face to knock him out, and distort his face and eye it seems, along with saving William's life, despite him obviously being left disabled from the attack. William is distraught by this and lashes out in the present, but Claire knows he's only doing this because he's afraid. It also turns out that Lyle is the reason William got scared on the boat and hit Merritt, having recognised him and got scared as a result. The real Sam Hague visited Lyle and they seem to patch things up, wanting to make amends to the past for what happened at the prison. In reality, Lyle decided to tie up loose ends, and after noting his reg plate, hopped aboard the ferry as a worker, where he helped his mum grab Merritt. On the day of his death, Sam spotted Lyle heading up the crag and decided to follow him from afar. Lyle knew he was being followed though and beat Sam down to a pulp. After taking his keys and gear, he dragged him to the edge of the cliff and pushed him off. He put clay on his hands and made it seem like he was up climbing and fell before dumping his bag in the back seat, wiping his car free of fingerprints and taking off with the keys. With all of this now explained, the situation involving Merritt hits critical levels. Lyle and Elsa intend to cover their tracks and leave, shutting everything off except for the pressure inside the chamber. Lyle works to methodically wipe everything down for fingerprints and eventually leaves with Elsa. As Akram and Carl head up to Moore again, they make it to the Jennings' compound and manage to track down Merritt's whereabouts. As they do, Rose does some digging and what she finds does not make for pleasant reading. After Clive Jennings died, which Lyle was responsible for given his violent and tumultuous past, Elsa was placed in involuntary psychiatric care for 19 months. Lyle and Harry were left alone for all that time, and this is where the hyperbaric chamber comes into it. When he was 15, Lyle seemingly coerced another boy into the decompression chamber. He kept increasing the pressure to see at what point the kid would lose consciousness, but it also solidified where he got the idea to hurt Merritt from. The bird sigil we've been seeing links to is actually from a company called Shorebird Ocean Systems, which Hardy manages to double check, investigating hyperbaric chambers online. Carl and Akram find Cunningham dead in the trunk of his own police car inside one of the warehouses nearby. They soon track down the hyperbaric chamber Merritt is being kept inside of too, and the pair scramble to shut off the air pressure. Through Hardy's call, they manage to stabilise the pressure, but not before Lyle shows up and shoots Carl. He stands in front of Akram to take the bullet, but thankfully it's not fatal for either of them. He and Akram work together and manage to kill Lyle, saving Merritt in the process. While she's transported in a hyperbaric stretcher to regulate the pressure, William shows up and manages to find his sister, courtesy of Moira and her helicopter. As for Elsa, she tries to slip away, but instead she's caught by police who immediately find her. Instead of facing jail time, she turns a gun on herself and blows her brains out. A suitably cowardly end for a woman blinded by anger and cowardice. With the case solved, Carl shows up back home where he finds Rachel there with Jasper and Martin. They're pretty surprised to see him shot again, but Carl is proud of himself, having acted selflessly this time to save Akram's life in the process of saving the day. Fast forward 3 months and Merritt is back on the mend. She shows up and thanks everybody at the station except Carl, who has taken some time off. Merritt is leaving too, taking William back to Moore to see her dad. She intends to patch things up with Jamie properly, having gained a lot of perspective from her experience. As for Stephen Burns, he finds Carl waiting in his office. He brings up the Kirsty Atkins situation and has decided he's not going to report him for colluding with Finch. He understands Stephen's perspective as a father himself, but this comes with strings. Carl demands a proper budget for his department from the Lord Advocate and wants Akram fast-tracked into the role of DI too. Although he's a political refugee here on asylum, he's damn good at his job and someone Carl can trust. I mean, the man did just take a bullet for him after all. Carl returns to the office in the basement alongside Rose and Akram, who prepare to work on more cold cases. However, they're not alone. Hardy is back and he rocks up at the police station on crutches. Moira has a case for him though, but it's not for Carl. It's not explicitly said, but it's implied that he could be the one that's now going to be in charge of the Leaf Park case, which is where season 1 of Dept Q comes to an end. Thanks for watching, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Smash a like or subscribe to the channel, your support is very much appreciated. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.